invented the light bulb. Why did he do that? Well, he was just a creative chap and he had this idea, and economists are happy to write down models of technological innovation and how technological innovation is critical for economic development and raising productivity and living standards. But for some reason, they're much more reluctant to write down models of institutional innovation. People do innovate. If you look at the U.S. Constitution, first day of the U.S. Constitution, James Madison showed up with his Virginia Plan. What was that? Here's a blueprint for how we do things. And so it was an institutional innovation, and that's a very, very interesting moment. You see that. It's actually, if you ever read the oral history of African societies, every oral history of African societies involves things like that. Involves Sunjata eats all the clan totems. In Africa, clans have these totems, which is usually an animal that you're not allowed to eat. So Sunjata eats all the clan totems. But he's rejecting the kinship, the clan system. He's breaking with the clan system because he's in the middle of building institutions. That example's not in the book, but, at some point you just want to get finished, and there's too many examples.
As China's role grows greater on the global stage, you want to stay up to date on the issues most pressing to China both domestically and internationally. Check out the Just China podcast for in-depth analysis on recent headlines and investigative reports on Chinese matters that affect our globalized world. We are Just China. Find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your podcast listening.
So you mentioned the U.S. Constitution, and so there are sometimes implicit norms, but there can also be implicit compromises. And you talk about how in some ways the U.S.'s entry into the corridor was a deal with the devil. I think you called it a Faustian bargain. Can you explain the implications of this compromise maybe presently?
Yeah, it's uncomfortable talking about things like that. We talk about this deal, and how liberty, or at least liberty for white men, was created in the US at the time of the Constitution. And, women even lost some political rights. Under the colonial institutions, women who had enough wealth were actually able to vote in some states, like in Philadelphia, if I remember correctly. So they lost rights. And obviously there was then this racial aspect of it. That is a dirty deal, because who was powerful? The powerful people were northern mercantile interests, nascent industrialists, southern slave owners like Madison and Washington and Jefferson. You had to somehow create a system of rules, respected their interests, and that went on for a long time. The Missouri Compromise in the 1820s. But, nothing is perfect. I think, the big picture of the US, if you compare it to Latin American countries like we do in Chapter 11, is that they all had very similar problems to solve. On balance, the US, maybe there were dirty deals, but they solved it much more effectively than any Latin American country did. So I guess from that perspective, the US has been a success story. But obviously the legacy, you see the legacy of that dirty deal, if you go out of the Harris School and turn, left and go 2 blocks, there's still an enormous amount of exclusion and marginalization in U.S. society. And, things like the Bill of Rights, it was implicitly recognized that this did not apply to black people, essentially, until the Warren Court, in the 1950s and 1960s, basically forced states to apply Bill of Rights to protect black people's rights. So that legacy of exclusion of Afro-Americans is still with us today. And it's just outrage, and in some sense, and we tell the story of the kind of how that propagated itself over time up to redlining and the creation of these urban ghettos. And I still just have never understood. I've been in the United States a long time, and I've never understood how that can persist without outrage. It's just, people should be outraged about that in this society, in this country, but they're also used to, this is the way things are, that nothing happens.
So in this podcast, we also try to understand the roots of conflict and what can be done about it. So it seems that the issue of populism has been linked to conflict in the past. So with some Harris students, we just returned from the Pearson Global Forum in Berlin. And I think that what I find striking is that the fact that Hitler was initially appointed under a democratic regime and the Weimar Republic, which seems very paradoxical. So I was wondering how does your theory may help us explain the rise of populist leaders, and why do you think that voters sometimes dismantle the checks and balances that can help constrain their leaders?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting example of a phenomenon that we would have had a hard time dealing with in Why Nations Fail, but actually, coincidentally, not by design, the framework in the narrow corridor actually can help you think about that. Because, in Why Nations Fail, in some sense, citizens are always in favor of inclusive institutions, and it's hard to imagine citizens overthrowing. The emphasis is very much on examples where inclusive institutions collapse because of almost like a kind of elite fomented coup, like in Venice. But I think, the Nazi example is a case where, it's some sense like popular discontent. Ordinary people get so discontented and alienated from the institutions that they lose all faith in them and they're willing to just overthrow them. So we try to talk about that in the book, in this chapter, the devil in the details. I would say the framework is flexible enough to talk about that. I'm not sure I completely understand it. I think if you look at the German case, it's a moment that's difficult to understand like nowadays, in the sense that, if you look at the way the Weimar Republic functioned, there were a third of the Congress people were communists who wanted to have a Soviet-style revolution and thought that democracy was like a bourgeois, whatever, institution. And then there was the Nazis who didn't like it. And then there were all of these traditional Prussians and conservatives who wanted to restore the monarchy. And so there was this very heavy hand of history of the moment of the Bolshevik Revolution, the 1917 revolution. In some sense, maybe you could say even so, okay. But the big fact was, until the Depression hit, the Nazis still only had 2 or 3% of the vote, and then the Depression hit and the Weimar institutions were completely incapable of dealing with the economic crisis. And then the Nazis surged, so the way we try to talk about this is that sometimes challenges or shocks can just run massively ahead of the ability of the institutions to cope with them. But it was really a kind of, I don't know, it was a double whammy, it was a treble or quadruple whammy that sunk the Weimar Republic. So, I mean, the good news is that it's hard to imagine that happening again. And the bad news, of course, is that if it does happen, it has calamitous effects for human beings and human society. In that we try to talk about how challenges, and, maybe that is happening a bit now. There's this massive increase in inequality, a lot of social and economic dislocation, which has been created by globalization, that institutions in the United States and Britain and elsewhere have singularly failed to address. And people don't know what the problem is. People blame it on migration, and that problem is not going to go away, and people are scared. So there are a lot of shocks and crises, and I think what you do see is this disillusionment with institutions, and then people can reach for radical solutions. Yeah.
But I think the response was very different in the US with the FDR and the a crisis, and like in Sweden, as you mentioned in the book. So like the response to the same shock can be very different in different places.
It could be, but it's good to remember, when we're talking about migration, that the US severely restricted immigration in the 1920s. Before the 1920s, you could basically show up at Ellis Island, and if you didn't have tuberculosis, they let you in. But the enormous restrictions were put on. And, one thing we do try to point out is that people are very selective in their memory. Like, I think populism, the progressives, and for example, in the 1890s, William Jennings Bryan, and, people remember good things about that, the support for antitrust and fighting big business and making the Senate directly elected, getting women votes, and, but there were also lots of really awful, ugly things associated with populism. Anti-Semitism, anti-immigrants, blaming Chinese people. Roosevelt, what about Roosevelt? Roosevelt tried to pack the Supreme Court. Roosevelt flagrantly and sneakily violated term limits. Two things that Trump, he hasn't dreamed of. He's probably dreamed of them, but he hasn't tweeted about them. I think our memory is a little bit selective about a lot of these social movements. Often there's a package and it's sort of 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and we tend to remember the 2 steps forward. So like the optimistic view of what's going on now is that actually there were all of these discontents and grievances in society which are perfectly legitimate and they need to be addressed. And I personally think that there's some issues which you can't make compromises over. I don't think you make compromises over discrimination against women or against minorities or black people or anti-Semitism. There's no like trade-off there. But I think discussing migration is a legitimate issue in a nation state. What rules do we want to have? I think that's a legitimate discussion. I don't think that's a discussion that every country in the world has had in the past, and the fact that that's coming up now, that's because people are unhappy about the current situation, and that's perfectly legitimate in a democracy.
It is. It reminds me of the term that was coined by Viktor Orban in 2014, illiberal democracy, and he's a leader who's talked a lot about migration, but it seems that based on your theories, illiberal democracy would be a conflict in terms.
The way I would think about it is in terms of the cage of norms, that there's many legacy. Think of the example that I was just giving of Weimar Republic, where there were huge legacies from the monarchical regime about how things should be done in the 1920s in Germany. And I would say in Hungary, there's all sorts of legacies from the past, legacies of anti-Semitism and conservative with a small c views. This is how I'd think about it. And I think if you look at Europe, what historians point out is that there's this very steep sort of gradient from west to east. There was mass serfdom and feudalism in Hungary until the 1848 revolution, when the serfs were freed. That Eastern Europe never modernized in the same way Western Europe did until very recently. So there's a long shadow of the past in Eastern Europe. And I think what we've seen with the European Union is that people massively overestimated the rapidity of social and institutional change. And they didn't have a realistic view. They somehow thought that this could all be wished, that Hungarian or Romanian or Bulgarian society could be completely reformed in a decade by the European Union. And I think what we've seen is that that's not true. And the adjustment is slower, and we just have to live with that, I think. And yeah, but I think, if you look at the history of Western Europe, you look at the nature of Western European society, that's very different from what you see in Eastern Europe. And you just have to accept that. You have to work with that. That's what Solon had to do.
I wanted to pivot a little bit. You were talking in the book, refuting really Francis Fukuyama's famous claim about the end of history in 1989 with the fall of the Soviet Union, and that it would usher in a period of increasing peace and prosperity. Instead, you warned us to expect diversity, which is a bit unsatisfactory. Do you see any trends within this diversity that you can point to? More countries entering the corridor or fewer?
The pattern in history is divergence, not convergence. And the convergence of all of these countries to liberal democracy was a very unlikely outcome. And Professor Fukuyama, makes a more subtle claim. So, in some sense, he doesn't really push the positive claim. He wanted to push, I think, more a normative claim, which is perhaps more interesting. And I'm not sure I have much to say about that. I think he's probably completely wrong about that too, because the Chinese, this idea that somehow liberal democracy established itself as the only legitimate system of authority in the world, I don't think that's what the Taliban think. That's not what the Chinese think. I think there's very different political philosophies in the world, in my experience. There's very different ideas about what constitutes legitimate political authority, and it doesn't look like liberal democracy. I'd like to write that book next. I think Acemoglu maybe disagrees with me, but in his defense, Professor Fukuyama he's a very interesting, clever man. I think he was more advancing the normative claim. He understood it was difficult positively, but I think both the positive and the normative claim are wrong. The book is about the positive claim in some sense. I think what we try to say towards the end of the book is, of course, the modern world is different. The modern world is different. Talking about serfdom and the 1848 revolution, labor repression has disappeared throughout the world. Discrimination against women, is non-heterosexual people is falling in large part. Like all sorts of, you see many things. Why is that? Well, partly that's to do with power. It's partly to do with women mobilizing and, getting organized. But it's also this language of rights, which we talk a little bit about, which I find sort of interesting. We're trying to do some research on this in Colombia and what was the impact of the 1991 Constitution that introduced these notions of rights. What was the effect of that on mobilization, and did it influence people's ability to engage in collective action, or did it lead them to demand different things? My sense is that that's been very important in making the corridor wider. It's much more difficult to have a despotic